One of the many skills that our readers need is to learn how to predict. And we know that predictions don't have to be correct, they just have to be made. Because as we read and we gain new information, we change our thinking, we change our predictions, and those may lead to even other predictions that can be made. Many of our fluent readers have learned this along the way, either through instruction or it's just something that they innately do. But for the majority of our readers, we need to be explicitly teaching this skill through the grades. And one of the ways that I do it is through a little prediction paper that I made. And I made it just very simply. It says the name of your guided reading book. There's a place for you to write your page number and then text evidence and then your prediction. When I run out of these sheets, I'm going to redo it, and I'm just going to say, instead of text evidence, because that I realize is just too teacher talkish for my students, I'm just going to say something like the statement or quotation that led you to your prediction, because what I'm looking for here is them to write actually the phrase or quotation that led or leads to their prediction. I have 4 different guided reading groups in my classroom this year. My students have neatly fallen into 4 different levels. So that means that I have 4 different books being read at every given moment. And, you know, that can seem a little challenging. But one of the things that I do to manage that is I have the groups mostly always do the same activity for whatever book they're reading. And that's what I love about the graphic organizer versus comprehension questions. Comprehension questions are specifically tuned to a particular book, whereas something like this is something that any book would work. And that's why one of the many reasons I love graphic organizers. I'm going to share with you how I modeled this lesson and then some examples of some of the work that my students did. And I modeled it by using this little book that I found in our teacher giveaway pile. It's called Abigail's Drum. It's a 3rd grade reader. And we first built background on the cover, and so they had some very good observations about this. And then I said, I'm going to start reading to you, and I'm going to stop at a really, really critical moment, and then we're going to predict. And I started with Rebecca Bates stood on the stony beach near the lighthouse. The sun had set and darkness was gathering on the ocean. Supper was finished. The kitchen was cleaned up. Chores were done for the moment. Finally, she could play her fife. And I stopped and said, do we know what a fife is? And no one knew what a fife was. So we looked it up. And then I had them write that in their composition books with the definition of a fife. The fife was a gift from her father, who had brought it home from one of his voyages when he had been a sea captain. You know, even there's a picture of a fife, even though there's a picture of a fife, they didn't know what a fife was. Sometimes if you have no idea what it is, the illustration doesn't even help. And the book goes on to talk about how she, you know, does chores with Pa and how she loves music. Rebecca didn't mind chores exactly, but music was where her love was. And she's looking out at the sea, and she says, somewhere out there, battles were being fought. It was the September of 1812, and America was at war with England again. My students didn't know that we had had a second war with England. Although the Revolutionary War had ended nearly 30 years ago, with the United States winning its independence, most Americans felt that England had never stopped trying to control their new country, and another war had started this summer. Pa is lighting the lighthouse lights when suddenly she heard an urgent ringing from overhead and stopped and looked up. What is it, Pa? She called, and that's where I stopped. And I said, what is going to happen next? What is the ringing all about? And they couldn't wait to predict. And I said, this is what we're going to do over the next weeks with our guided reading. And several of them said, well, can we read this book? And I said, no, we're not reading this book. I mean, maybe I'll let them read it later, but this isn't going to be their guided reading book. But boy, were they primed and ready for predicting. Except G. G really struggled with knowing where to predict, so I had to work extra with him on that. But here are some of their examples. I'd like to show you one that was reading in his group, Mr. Popper's Penguin. His quote was, "There was a lot of penguins on the cover." Well, that's not a quote. And his prediction, "It's a man with a lot of penguins." Not exactly a prediction. So am I getting comprehension information from a graphic organizer? Absolutely. And I can see exactly what I need to work on with this student and how thankful I am that the school year isn't over yet and I still have time. One of my groups is reading Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. We've fallen quite in love with this book. I'll be doing another video on it soon. But Joya makes a prediction from the cover, but it's quite different than the previous one I just shared. At first glance, I predicted, and then her prediction. The story is about rats who escape NIMH being the National Institute of Mental Health, and Mrs. Frisby helps. Now, if you've read this book, you know that Mrs. Frisby's helping the rats is not her role. So that is not a correct prediction, but it doesn't matter. She's thinking about what she is going to read, and she'll change that prediction as she goes along. Ava makes a prediction, too, from this. Mrs. Frisby has gotten to the community of rats, and the left fork leads to the main hall. They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for a surprise," says one of the rats. And Ava says, "I predict that the rats of NIMH are going to show Mrs. Frisby the plan." Another one of my groups is reading Ramona the Pest. We've been doing a lot of Beverly Cleary books in this group. And Jane says, "All right, Ramona," Beezus said, "if I read to you, will you stop riding your tricycle?" "Yes," said Ramona, and Jane has all of the correct quotation marks and punctuation for her quote. Her prediction, "I predict Ramona will not stop riding her bicycle." She has learned that Ramona doesn't always do what Ramona says she's going to do. Later, she makes another prediction. "Why, hello," said Mrs. Robinson pleasantly. "Oh, Ramona, you're supposed to be playing in the sandbox." And Jane stops and says, "I predict that Ramona is going to throw a fit." Jane has learned very well the character traits of Ramona, as you can see. So all I have them do with their book is I have them read, and do one of these a week, and then keep track of their vocabulary in their composition books. And, you may think, is that enough? That doesn't seem very meaty. Well, what is the main focus of their instruction? Should it be spending the majority of their time doing activities or the majority of their time reading? And for me, I want them to be spending the majority of their time reading, supported with things by graphic organizers. I never want the activity to eclipse the main activity of reading. And when I look at the MAP scores that we just took, our second round of assessing for this year, and I can see the growth and development, I can argue that yes, this is good. These are good activities for them to do. I found that predictions started spilling into other areas. They started making predictions, and even in math, they said, "Oh, I predict you're going to," They started making predictions about what I was going to do. At Read Aloud, students were coming, and they're at my feet in Read Aloud and saying, "Oh, I have a prediction." And sometimes I'll let them share those predictions. Other times I don't, because, some students don't like spoilers because sometimes their predictions can be spot on correct. It was really fun for me to see G coming up to me with his Deer book, which he didn't have to do one of these for Deer, right? Deer is just for pleasure, and pointing and saying, "Mrs. Matsuda, is this a good place to predict?" So he was predicting as we go. And that shows me that this is a skill that's transferable. Are comprehension questions a transferable skill? How many of us finish a book, close it, and then make comprehension answers? I don't know anyone that does that. But predicting is a skill that they can use throughout their lives, and we want them to be lifelong readers. As they're reading through their lives, they'll make predictions, and it will just help them with their comprehension. So I hope that you will find this helpful in your classroom this week and this month, because we do need to teach our students how to predict.